This building in Chicago. That is the Willis Tower, unless you are from Chicago, in which case you're calling it the Sears Tower. So the Sears Tower, like I said, tallest building in Chicago. And when it was built in 1974, that was the tallest building in the world. And it kept that title until 1998, 24 years, which is a long time to hold on to that tallest building in the world title. It is 1,451 feet tall. So we've got another incredibly tall building here in the Windy City. Let's talk about that drift again. Because the Sears Tower, it does sway in heavy winds. It actually sways up to 8 inches, and that's enough where you can feel it. Now, the reason you don't want to be in a drifting building is because you can get a little seasick, a little nauseous in a moving building. But to help combat that, when they created the Sears Tower, they made it out of a bundle of columns. So if you looked at it from a bird's eye view, it would look like a 3x3 grid of 9 columns. And think about it like a stick that you put in the ground. Pretty easy to blow that stick over. But if you take that stick in the ground and then surround it with 8 other sticks and bind all those sticks together, it becomes much harder to blow that over. So that's the idea behind bundling the columns. And the second way that we talk about dealing with drift, we'll be talking about that third way a little bit later in the tour. How do you measure a tall building like the Sears Tower, though? It goes from its lowest open-air public entrance to the top of its roof, or spires. Now those antennae on top, temporary mechanical equipment. They do not count in the height of the Sears Tower. But just those antennas are about the same height as those black box buildings that we talked about on the way in. So imagine one of those buildings on top of the Sears Tower. That's how tall just those antennae are, 300 feet tall. But the current tallest building in the country is the One World Trade Center in New York City. It is the patriotic height of 1776. However, it's got a spire on it, a spire that people can't go into. And the roof of the One World Trade Center is actually 83 feet shorter than the roof of our Sears Tower, which is what we'll call architectural cheating. But you know what, we'll give it to New York anyway. 1776 is still very impressive for a skyscraper. And now you can see the Sears Tower sort of tucked itself away. We have one last thing to talk about with it though, and that's the naming situation. Is it the Willis? Is it the Sears? What's going on? I will answer all those questions, but before we get to that, you all are gonna get a great view of the Sears Tower from its base up to the roof, in between these two buildings here. So make sure you get your cameras ready. It is kind of a quick glimpse as we pass on by. And you'll even be able to see the sky deck where people are looking down on us as we look up at them. And that's those glass boxes that are sticking out from the side of the building. So feel free to wave at those people up there. Who knows if they can actually see us or not, but it's good to be neighborly. But now let's talk about that naming situation, because it does get confusing, especially if you're in Chicago for the first time. The Sears Tower was built for the Sears department store, but then they leave the building in the 1990s to move out to the suburbs, and a little bit after that, the Willis Insurance brokerage firm ends up leasing a few floors as well as the naming rights to it. And nothing against the people at Willis. I'm sure they are fine, upstanding people, but us Chicagoans are a little bit nostalgic and, let's face it, a little bit stubborn. So we've all decided as a group that we are not gonna call it the Willis Tower. We're gonna keep calling it the Sears Tower. And the way I like to explain that to people is that you might see on a map, it's spelled W-I-L-L-I-S, but the way you pronounce that is Sears. But now let's talk about one of my favorite things about Chicago. One of the reasons I've been here for over 10 years, and that's the food. We have amazing food here in this city, and we're famous for a lot of it. Food like deep dish pizza. Now, if you want my recommendation on where to get a good deep dish, and this is very polarizing depending on who you talk to in Chicago, I like Lou Malnati's. Oh, I'm glad that's getting audible woos. That's where you get an entire hubcap of sausage on your pizza. What was yours? Oh, Carmen, sure, absolutely. Yeah, Carmen's is a great one. Another one that is kind of up and coming that a lot of locals are kind of rallying around is a place called Pequod's Pizza, where they actually burn cheese onto the crust of it, so you get that little cheesy burniness. But then we also have Italian beef sandwich. That's roast beef simmered in its own juices. Put that on a French roll, dunk the whole thing back in those juices, top it with some spicy jardinera or some sweet peppers. It's sloppy and delicious. We've also got one of Oprah's favorite things, which is the Chicago mix popcorn. Sweet caramel flavored popcorn with a salty cheese flavored popcorn that you can get at Garrett's. That's the place to get it. I know it sounds like it shouldn't go well together, but it really does. But my favorite of the Chicago foods has to be the Chicago style hot dog. And we're gonna spend more time than we probably should talking about a hot dog, because that's how much I love it. So the Chicago dog is said to have been dragged through the garden because of all of its toppings. But there is one topping any Chicagoan will tell you does not belong on a Chicago dog. And if you know what it is, you can say it with me: ketchup. I love how many of you said that, and I am here to tell you, unfortunately, that is true. You should not put ketchup on a Chicago dog. You can put it on whatever other hot dog you want, but not a Chicago dog. And well, a lot of people give a lot of different reasons why. One is that it already has tomatoes on it, so then why does it need ketchup? Another goes back to the Chicago stockyards that we talked about earlier, that meat packing industry. It was thought that if a vendor put ketchup on your hot dog, they might be trying to cover up the taste of some bad meat. But my favorite reason for why you don't put ketchup on a Chicago dog goes back to how each ingredient makes it on the dog in the first place. And that goes back to the Maxwell Street Market. The Maxwell Street Market is an open-air public market that was created by the immigrants of Chicago, as well as the black community that was living here. Those were the groups that weren't allowed to trade in the downtown business district, so they created their own place of commerce. And it is there that the Chicago dog was born. You've got an all-beef dog with a poppy seed bun made by and for Jewish immigrants who were looking to keep kosher. You've then got mustard, comes from Germans, always put mustard on their sausages. Neon green relish comes from an old Irish recipe called piccalilli that has evolved over the generations. You've then got Greek immigrants who top a hot dog a lot like a gyro with onions and tomatoes. A dill pickle spear for Eastern Europeans, sport peppers from Mexican immigrants, and then the only American thing on a Chicago dog, a shake of celery salt. And that's because celery was grown in this area. So the Chicago hot dog is really this melting pot of all these immigrant cultures, all of these natives by choice that were coming to Chicago to build their lives here. So the reason you don't put ketchup on a Chicago dog is because it covers up the taste of the American dream. And yes, that is the cheesiest line of my tour. Thank you all for listening to it. Oh, thank you. Thank you. But now let's talk about some of the nicknames that Chicago gets. Nicknames like the city that works, which we do. We are a very blue-collar town here, but we also work because we function. We have a great public transportation system. Definitely grab a picture of the Green Line train going by. So those trains are called the L because they are elevated above street level. So you just saw how that train went by right on cue, like I planned it. And then a bunch of those trains make a loop in our downtown area, so that area is called the Loop. So if you ever hear anybody say, I'm taking the L to the Loop, they're saying I'm taking our public trains downtown. So that's some Chicago lingo for you while you're in the city. But now we are entering back into Wolf Point, where we're going to be going back up the main branch of the Chicago River, and again, we're going to go past the dock and out towards the lake to give you all a great view of the city before we'll turn around and head back to the dock that you all boarded on. But as we head up the main branch of the Chicago River, let's talk about the Merchandise Mart again. That big old building on the left side of the river now. We talked about its Art Deco design on the way in. Now let's talk about how big it is, because that is a giant building. In the 1930s, that was the largest building in the world. Not the tallest, the largest. It has 73 football fields of floor space. It's got 7.5 miles of just hallways. In the 1930s, this building was so big, it had its own police station, its own fire station, and it needed its own zip code. Even just the facade of the Merchandise Mart is 2.5 acres. So what do we do with that 2.5 acre facade? Well, we project art onto it. It's called Art on the Mart. It happens after sundown, I think at like 9 or 9:30. You can check online for more specific times, but they use 34 projectors that project art onto every square inch of that 2.5 acre facade. Except the windows. They actually use lasers to figure out where the windows are and don't shine light in because they don't want to disrupt people that might be working late, which is very considerate. And in fact, over on the right side of the river coming into view, you'll see a black box. And in that black box are the 34 projectors that project up on the Merchandise Mart. But now let's talk about these green heads that are outside of the Merchandise Mart. Those are the merchandising princes that shopped at the wholesale Merchandise Mart. So generally people that own their own department store. Marshall Field is up there, as well as Wanamaker. But I've heard if you climb up to those heads and push them back, a brick of candy pops out of the neck. It's a good old Pez dispenser joke for you. You don't get those too frequently anymore. Now on the right side of the river, you can see these metal poles sticking out of the water. At the bottom of those poles, there's a bunch of plants growing up around them. The roots of those plants hang down into the water, and they give fish a safe place to spawn. So those areas are, no joke, called fish hotels, because it gives them that sort of safe spot to go and have an intimate moment away from predators. But in the 1970s, there were only about 10 species of fish living in the Chicago River. Now, thanks to measures like the fish hotels, we have over 70 species of fish. So we're really doing our part to clean up that ecosystem. Now let's talk about this red brick building on the left side of the river with the clock tower up at the top of it. In order to talk about that building, we gotta talk about the street that's in front of it, LaSalle Street. Now, on that 1909 Burnham plan that we talked about earlier, they wanted to widen LaSalle Street, but that building was in the way. So what they did is they lopped off a big chunk of that building and then repaired up the facade to it. And they did such a great job repairing the facade, you can't really tell what happened. But I've got a key for you all to figure it out. Count the number of windows on each side of the clock tower. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bays of windows on the left, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bays of windows on the right. So this is a lopsided building. And really, isn't that why you take architecture tours like this in the first place? Is to hear about this stuff you wouldn't get if you were just walking by. I mean, look at these schmoes over there. They got no idea that's a lopsided building. Now I'm gonna take a real quick drink of water and I'll be back on the mic in a second. Okay, so as we are drifting under the Clark Street Bridge on the right side of the river, you're gonna see a cute little building, number 55. We here at Shoreline Sightseeing love number 55. In fact, we have a nickname for it. We like to call number 55 the Danny DeVito building. And it's pretty easy to see why. It's kind of short and squat in between those two tall towers. But that style of architecture for the Danny DeVito building, it's called brutalism. You see it a lot with universities and government buildings. It's got those real deep inset windows with all that exposed concrete on the outside of it. And when I was first learning about brutalism, I assumed that it came from the word brutal, but it actually comes from the French words béton brut, which mean rough concrete. So that's why it's a brutalism building, because of all the concrete that's on the outside of it. But now as we are drifting under the bridge, on the right side of the river, you're gonna see a green building with a golden top to it. It's behind that Morton Steakhouse. That is the Carbide and Carbon building. Now the Carbide and Carbon building was built during Prohibition, when alcohol was illegal here in the United States. And so a lot of people say that they built the Carbide and Carbon building to look like a giant bottle of champagne. Which it really kind of does, right? It's got that green base and that thin gold top, and I think that gives you a great idea of how Chicagoans felt about Prohibition while it was going on. Because if you know anything about Chicago history, you know that they were drinking their way through Prohibition. But now, let's talk about the Chicago River. The Chicago River flows west, away from Lake Michigan, but it didn't always used to. In fact, up until the late 1800s, the Chicago River had always flowed east into the lake. But in the late 1800s, this river, like any river in an industrial city, was being used as a giant sewer system. So all that sewage water was flowing into Lake Michigan and into Chicago's drinking water, leading to outbreaks of cholera and all kinds of other diseases. So instead of cleaning up the river, a woo for cholera, I guess. So instead of cleaning up the river like any of us would do today, figure there was no EPA, no environmental consciousness in the late 1800s, so they called in the Army Corps of Engineers, who spent years digging a 28-mile trench connecting this river to a river system on the other side of a continental divide. They actually moved more earth digging that trench than when they made the Panama Canal. And so when they connected those two river systems, it permanently reversed the flow of the Chicago River, taking all that sewage water and flushing it down to the Gulf of Mexico, which I know doesn't sound great. But we are no longer polluting the Chicago River the way they were in the late 1800s. So now, all that's getting flushed down to the Gulf of Mexico is that clean, pristine Lake Michigan water. But now, we're coming back up on the Wrigley building, that first building that we started with, the Spanish Revival style building. Look to the right of that, you will see another Revival style building. That's the Tribune Tower. Now the Tribune Tower is also modeled after a European cathedral, this time from France. Look up to the top of it and you can see those arches leading away from the main part. Those arches are called flying buttresses. You see flying buttresses a lot with French Gothic architecture, so that style is called French Gothic Revival, because it's bringing back that style for the early 1920s. And so many of the buildings in this area are from the early 1920s. This is sort of our unofficial cathedral district of Chicago. And butting its way into that cathedral district, we have an Apple store. Ooh. There are some interesting things about that Apple store though. That glass is load-bearing glass. Look up to the roof of it, looks a little bit like an iPad or maybe a MacBook Air. It's a great example of how architects can advertise something without really advertising it. Side of the river, you will see our NBC Tower coming into view. The NBC Tower has the peacock all the way up at the top of it. Now the NBC Tower is based off of 30 Rockefeller Plaza in New York City. However, 30 Rock is an Art Deco building. Ours was built in the 1980s, so it can't be called Art Deco. Instead, it's called a very fun combination of words, Echo Deco, because it echoes back to that design. But now you all are going to get a brief glimpse of the Hancock Tower. That's going to be in between these two buildings here, kind of in the distance. It's going to be a black trapezoid-shaped building with some rabbit ears or antennas up at the top of it. And that should be coming into view for me right about now. The signature room that is just below that observation deck, get virtually the same view and use that money to buy yourself a fancy cocktail instead. In fact, we celebrate our anniversaries at the signature room. And this is the saddest part of the tour, where you all find out that I am a married man. So sorry to break your hearts out there. But now on the right side of the river, behind that James Hardy building, you can see a building with a bunch of oddly shaped balconies on it. That is called the Aqua Tower. And those balconies kind of look like waves coming over the building. So that's why it's called the Aqua Tower. But those balconies are actually built for a social reason. Because if my neighbor walked out onto their balcony and I walked out onto mine, they are offset so that we can have a conversation with each other. So it shows how architecture can have these social functions as well as just stuff to make the building look cool. But now, on the right side of the this wavy blue building. It's like it jumped out of a Dr. Seuss book or something. Regis Tower. The St. Regis Tower is the third tallest building here in Chicago. Designed by a native architect, Jeannie Gang, who is actually from the Chicagoland area. And Jeannie Gang is becoming a little bit of a celebrity here in Chicago. And that's because she is a certifiable genius, as in she won a MacArthur Genius Grant. She was also chosen over hundreds, if not thousands of other architects to do the $8.5 billion redesign of O'Hare Airport. And that's because she was that talented. But I mentioned that the St. Regis Tower is the third tallest building here in Chicago. However, that is the tallest building in the world designed by a female-led architecture firm. So we are, yeah, you can give it up for Jeannie Gang and the St. Regis. We are very glad to have both of them right here in our city, and there is so much to talk about with the St. Regis. We're going to actually talk about it again after we do our turn around and head back this way when we go back towards the dock. But now check out this neighborhood on your left. This neighborhood is called Streeterville, and it's got a fascinating history because it didn't used to exist. As in, the land that it's on didn't exist. The shoreline for Lake Michigan was much further in until a guy by the name of Captain Streeter crashed his boat on the shore and left it there for years, letting silt build up around it. Captain Streeter then starts talking to some builder friends of his, and he goes, hey, if you got any landfill that you're looking to get rid of, why don't you just dump it by my boat? And they do. So some of these buildings are actually built on landfill that's from the Great Chicago Fire. But here's where Captain Streeter gets a little bit shady. He starts selling that land. Now the city didn't like that. They go, hey, Captain Streeter, this is Chicago land. You can't sell it. And he goes, oh, no, no, no. Here is a map of Chicago. This land is not a part of it. This is an independent district of the U.S. called Streeterville. Now the city didn't like that either. Neither did the people that own the shoreline. So they send cops and thugs to try and get him out of Streeterville. And he fights them off with buckshot. They then try and charge Captain Streeter with attempted murder, and he goes, oh, no, no, no. I used buckshot that is non-lethal. And that argument gets him off. Now, eventually, Streeterville became a part of Chicago, but Captain Streeter was such a huckster, it said that the mayor of Chicago went to his funeral to, quote, make sure he was really dead. So that's the fascinating history of Captain Streeter and Streeterville. But now on the left side of the river coming into view under the Lakeshore Drive Bridge, you can start to see Navy Pier. Navy Pier is one of the great cultural attractions of the Midwest. If you're looking for stuff to do at Navy Pier, a few things I'd like to suggest. One is the Ferris wheel. It really is pretty cool. Plus the cars are enclosed, so if you're scared of heights like I am, they're a little bit easier to go up into. And because the cars are enclosed, they are climate controlled, heated during the winter, air conditioned during the summer. Another thing I like to suggest is Shoreline Sightseeing's Classic Lake Tour, where you get some real panoramic views of the city, as well as of the lake itself. And then tonight, they are doing fireworks at Navy Pier. So if you want to see some fireworks for free, definitely head to the pier and see those get set off. But speaking of views, coming in behind you all is a pretty gorgeous view of Chicago. So what's about to happen is our captain is going to kind of take us out and turn us around. As he does that, he's going to give you all plenty of opportunities to take some pictures of or with the Chicago skyline. I'm going to jump off the mic during this time to let you all take those pictures, but then I'll be back on the mic once we get a little closer to that Lakeshore Drive Bridge that we just passed under.
Wait.